so let's look at another example. That is a chart from UNESCO report, Cracking the Code, Girls in STEM. That's also a very credible source. Let's look at this one. Okay, so that's a good one because it packs lots of information. I like this a lot, actually. So this is a multi-series line chart. Sometimes it's called a trend and progression chart. So on the y-axis, we see the percentages, and on the x-axis, we see the career and education stages, right? So for men and women, we see that, for male and female, as you see. And then 2 time points, 2008 and 2014. So let's first look at why does the researcher choose to represent the data in this way, right? Why not a bar plot? Why not a pie chart? Why a trend regression line? So these kind of design choices or charts are used to answer the question of what is the overall pattern? What trends lines are used for summarizing the direction of a relationship, if it's an upward and downward trend, showing average tendencies, for example, and helping detect positive, negative, or no association. And typical questions that trend lines, these kind of lines, actually answer is that, is there any upward or downward pattern? Is the relationship actually linear? And these work because they reduce the complexity. They usually reduce the complexity in lines, which is easier for the human mind to grasp. And they help the eye to see the structure in the noisy data. Okay, so what we can safely say, just by looking at this chart, is that first of all, it shows the proportion of women and men at different stages of higher education and research, averaged globally, right? So we have 226 countries. That's a UNESCO report. So what we can safely say, at the bachelor's level, women and men are near parity, right? They're very similar, right? It's just like barely different. At the master's level, women slightly outnumber men. At the doctoral level, men begin to outnumber women. And among researchers, you see the gap is actually very large, men comprising a much higher share. So this pattern appears in 2008 and 2014, right? And the gap widens at later stages. So gender parity at entry does not translate into parity at senior research levels. Can we say that? So in the bachelor's degree, there's gender parity, but then it doesn't carry on, it doesn't translate into the senior research levels, like after doctoral degrees. So this is what the plot can tell us. What this plot doesn't tell us is actually more important, right? Because that's usually where the decision makers fail to understand what the data actually can support. These are, sometimes they may overclaim, that would lead to wrong policies and so on and so forth. So it's very important not to overclaim. So the plot doesn't tell us, first of all, why women's representation declines, right? Or whether the same individuals, so we don't know if these are the same individuals, right? So this is an aggregate data. So we don't know whether the same individual progressed through each stage. We also don't know whether men and women drop out different rates. We don't know the differences by the country. We have so many countries, more than 200 countries. We don't know their field of study. We don't know the institution type. We don't even know if these differences are statistically significant, okay? We can only observe a trend here. Usually people commonly jump to wrong conclusions where when they see this trend, and then especially when it's kind of consistent with the narrative, they may say, oh, women leave science because they choose to. Look like they're leaving science at the senior stages. It is so tempting to say that for a lot of people because they see a smooth downward slope for women, and of course the cultural narrative about choice. Women do that. We see that because they choose to give up on the researchers. That's a very strong dominant cultural narrative about the choice, but it is wrong because the chart, first of all, shows representation. It doesn't tell us about choices. It doesn't tell us about institutional barriers, constraints, the policies, what systematic barriers that women had to go through, right? It just shows a downward trend. Of course, a better phrasing would be in this case, women's representation decreases at later stages, but the reasons are not observable here. We literally don't have any evidence about the reasons, okay? Another misconception is that this proves discrimination in research. Okay, this is very tempting. This is very consistent with the narrative also, right? The drop-off is large, the pattern is systematic, but this is methodologically incorrect because, first of all, we should know just by looking at one metric, we can't say discrimination is happening here, discrimination is not happening here, because discrimination is a systemic issue, it's a mechanism. This chart only shows the outcomes and it suggests the associations, but no information on hiring, promotion, funding, evaluation. We don't know any of these. But it definitely shows a large gap that is not good, right? That is not okay to see that kind of a barrier, to kind of a gap, which potentially caused by a barrier. Precise language would be the pattern is consistent. We can all agree on that, right? The pattern is consistent with structural barriers, but this chart alone cannot isolate discrimination, okay? Another misconception would be the pipeline leaks at the PhD level. That's where the leaking happens, and then after that, at the research level, women actually drop out. So why is it tempting to say that? We see the drop appears there, and it's misleading because, first of all, the X stages are not timed, right? It is not timed. So maybe someone starts the doctoral level so late or not after master. Yeah, it is not a time element, right? And different cohorts are represented at each stage. So one important insight that we should understand here when we look at the x-axis is that these are just categories, and this is not the longitudinal pipeline. So in other words, it's not we look at the same individual for the bachelor's, for the master, doctoral, researcher. No, it's a cross-sectional snapshot. We just like take a picture, and this is very important. And another misconception, like overclaim, okay, would be these are global universal patterns. Because first of all, it is tempting to conclude that, to say that, because it is labeled as a world average, of course, right? We may tend to say that, but it is wrong. First of all, averages, we need to be aware. Averages hide massive variation. We just take an average, we just collapse the information into one context. Some countries, some fields may show completely different patterns. We just need to be aware that it is important to understand that these are global averages, and global averages smooth out local averages or local realities, what's happening in the local, okay? Good questions that you should be asking is that, are these the same people at each stage? Is it a longitudinal study? And if not, as we discussed, what are the implications? What are the overclaims, potential overclaims you may be making? And what process determines to become a researcher? Maybe there are different definitions in different countries. We should be aware of those. What kind of claims can we find evidence? What claims would go beyond the data? So the only conclusion that we can make from this chart is that this chart shows that women's representation declines at higher levels of academic and research careers, the doctoral and the research levels, relative to men. And this indicates a widening gender gap at later stages. However, because the data are cross-sectional and not longitudinal, aggregated globally, the chart doesn't explain the causes of this pattern or track individuals' career progression. It's very, very important to understand it is not about causality, it is about association.